What's good, kiddos? Welcome back to the Warframe speculation series. For this one, we're going to rapid fire a few of Vlad's remaining questions to start, because 3 of these questions are essentially hanging threads in the story of Warframe, things that have been set up as potential hooks for future stories that have not gone anywhere yet. The first one is the Lotus, striking her own bargain with the man on the wall. What did the Lua miracle cost? So that is a question that I think is pretty straightforward if we just look at the events of the old piece in isolation, which is that in some manner, the ability for the Tenno to have been able to be hidden in the void or to achieve some kind of peace in their transference chambers or have some kind of more stable control over their void powers was probably negotiated by the Lotus with the man in the wall, there was some kind of dynamic there that is left unsaid that allows the Tenno to be in the place where they are, such as with the man in the wall saying in the 1999 quest that our powers were given to us freely. Yes, we were given the powers before the Lotus entered into the picture, but the Tenno were in a pretty bad way after those powers were received, and they remained in that bad way until after Margulis, the events of the old piece, and then eventually the Lotus took the Tenno under their wing and began caring for them. At some point in the timeline after the Zariman incident, the Tenno were able to achieve some kind of peace and stability, but the influence of the man on the wall was always there. And so to a certain extent, I think we can see the bargain between Wally and the Lotus as being something that Wally likely did with fourth dimensional eternalism foreknowledge of different events that would happen, with the Tenno essentially resisting and overthrowing the Orokin Empire. And so my personal headcanon, until we have more information on that, is that the Lotus essentially negotiated with the man in the wall to agree to allow the Tenno to, or agreed to work with the Tenno to overthrow the Orokin Empire, which is something she was kind of planning to do already, or to allow them to do so more effectively so that she could achieve that end of overthrowing the Orokin Empire without the children of the Zariman being in any kind of danger as a result of using their powers too aggressively, too much, or in too much of an uncontrolled way. It is a difficult thing to speculate on because really we only have the very few lines of being reminded by the man in the wall of a deal that he struck with the Lotus, and the Lotus telling us during the Lotus Eaters prequel that there is that song of the void that she is able to hear, that she's able to respond with her own power of song, and that there are a select few sentients who have a unique power of song that does different things, that interacts with the void. Adis had a power of song which the operator connected with during the old piece. The Lotus has a power of song that's able to directly resist the man in the wall. The man in the wall has a power of song that was used to create the void angels that spreads his influence across wherever he's able to exist by way of strands of Craw, eternalism, timey-wimey nonsense. But if I would project to do a very, very out there idea of what the bargain is between the Lotus, the powers that are involved with the Tenno, and the deal that they were able to strike, regardless of what the Lotus gained from it, I think the cost is that the man in the wall, one of their ultimate goals is to become real, to exist in the origin system, in the main universe of the Warframe setting, not as himself, but as a person with a body of their own to exist in. And so if we're talking about what the miracle was, the exchange of hiding Lua in the void was meant to cost, I would speculate that the man in the wall was supposed to receive one of the Tenno children's bodies to be their permanent body. The same way that the Orokin used the Kuva to do the Yuvan ceremony to move their consciousness to one body, from one body to another. We know that the Kuva is intrinsically linked with the man in the wall and the man in the wall's power, thanks to the Duviri codex entries. I think that the man in the wall wanted to live and exist as one of the Tenno children, and that specific child who is the chosen one is whoever we, the player, happen to be playing as. And essentially, Lotus did not uphold her end of the bargain. She made the deal, but she refused to give up any of her children to be that sacrificial body that the Man in the Wall could take over. How the Lotus was able to do that from the position of being a sentient that can't go into the void, but is somehow caretaking all of the children in the Tenno Reservoir who are in the void, I'm not sure. It is suggested that the Tenno faction has far more access to support through things like the Syndicate network than we actually get to see, especially with the Follies Hunt update. We have a little bit more lore on how the Arbiters of Hexus have always been supporting and serving the development of the Tenno independently, and I guess during the Orokin era, secretly supporting them and establishing the Tenno as their own system of a ruling class of some sort, or at least supporting the Tenno's developing culture and being a subservient part to the Tenno's developing culture. We aren't fully aware, but Zorba, I believe that's his name, from the Follies Hunt quest, does explain that the Arbiters of Hexus has always been in support of and loyal to the Tenno as a faction, even when the Tenno kind of first got introduced to the Orokin society after the Zeramin 10-0 incident went down. So that would be my ultimate guess, that the Lotus negotiated with the Man in the Wall to have the means necessary to actually hide the Lua in the void, and he was supposed to receive a body so as to be able to exist independently of others who have been possessed or influenced by him. But then the Lotus betrayed him and said, "Nuh-uh, we're gonna not do that, but I'm gonna keep everything I got from you." So from the Man in the Wall's perspective, he was screwed over by the Orokin and then screwed over by the Lotus and the Tenno, and is being currently screwed over by our ongoing resistance of him. If you look at the story of this universe from the Man in the Wall's perspective, all of this seems like a really raw deal, being manipulated and used for the ends of others just because he is a source of power and nothing else, not being respected as an individual. I got a lot of empathy for the Man in the Wall, I just don't agree with anything he's doing. It's kind of a rough position to be in. Next question from Vlad, the nature of the Stalker between a Tenno, a Warframe kind of like Umbra Excalibur, and everything else about him. They felt that this question was too shallow, but I don't think it's too shallow. I think this is actually one we don't need to speculate on all that much. We were informed, I believe it was during the first Jade Shadows arc, that the Stalker is what is called a Low Guardian, which is a lesser class of Warframe, creation that is not quite a full Warframe, wasn't as successful or as stable as the Warframes were, but is at least still empowered, still a powerful figure, didn't lose their consciousness, maintained a portion of their ability to speak, maintained the ability to self-direct, they just weren't quite as strong. So I think we can sort of understand what a Low Guardian is as being on a kind of spectrum. There's the Proto-Frame, which is a stronger but slower acting Warframe infestation. There is the Low Guardian, which is a more total Warframe infestation, but less powerful, and therefore doesn't have as many of the effects that Ballas wanted, such as the characteristics that would present them as mindless beasts to be controlled. And then there is the full Warframe, which has all of those characteristics and is a much more severe version of the Technocyte infestation than all of the others. And I guess like at the very bottom of that, we can still include the Necromex, where we are transferring into an actual corpse that pilots a robot as a battery conduit. That one's probably the weirdest. As for what else is going on with him, I honestly think we got a really solid and really complete picture of what the Stalker's motivations were about, what his ultimate goals were, and where he was pointed as a character who is now mostly concerned with raising and taking care of the child that Jade gave him. And we're literally about to see the results of him deciding to keep to his own business and just raise his children and not really worry about us all that much anymore in the Jade Shadow's Part 2 story. All right, and now the last of Lad's questions. Who keeps up Narmer? Why does he have a ram head on him? Okay, so ram head, I think that's the simpler question to answer. The Archons were amalgams, out of like the corpus amalgams between sentience and corpus bodies. The Archons were amalgams between sentient corpses and Warframe bodies, which is why we're able to see things like it was Amar's head. We met Amar during the old piece, but Amar's corpse was used to create an amalgam of Amar and a Warframe in order to bring back a sentient in a powerful position so as to aid Narmer and their control of the origin system and their eventual plan to consume the sun and leave for Tau that we ultimately ended up thwarting. But a big part of the old war quest was the survivability of a sentient body, a sentient person, even if the mental stability can be damaged or even completely destroyed, the body can continue to exist. We also already know that from the Eidolons on the plains of outside of Cetus. Sometimes sentient souls appear to be able to exist and persist longer than the bodies, or their bodies are semi-attached to or keeping the bodies, their souls are somewhat semi-attached to or keeping the bodies alive, something like that. Point is, they're very long-lived, they're very adaptable, they're hard to kill. That is a sentient's main shtick, being hard to kill. So if they had the body of Amar and were able to empower it with these Archon crystals and being attached to a Warframe to form an amalgam, then they could create a very powerful asset for the Narmer army. We use the Archon crystals in the same way in order to restore the Lotus, but rather than keeping that half-dead state persistent and doing that amalgam thing, we were trying to use a bunch of Archon crystals to fully restore her, which we appeared to have done successfully. So why does Pazul have a ram head? Supposedly it is because there was some already deceased sentient that was ram-headed, that was then turned into an amalgam with Era's body in order to keep Era alive as the new leader of Narmer, so that the Narmer faction would not collapse after the war, after Era died, when he made that noble sacrifice to allow us to continue and pursue Ballas to confront him on the Pregasa. The specifics of it being a ram head are a little bit more about story inspirations and cultural inspirations, which I believe I covered a little bit in my video on the New War all those years ago. But as I've already talked about in this series, the reason why Narmer persists or continues to persist as a organization or hierarchy is because I believe mainly that the faction are true believers. They prefer the lifestyle that was presented by the Narmer organization, by the Veils, of giving up, the old factional disputes, of being worried about self-direction, but they still ultimately have that fear of the origin system coming to the end. It's more of a death cult than the other factions in the origin system right now, but they are worried about the end. They are trying to reach the promised land. They need a religious figurehead to exist. When Ballas died, when Ballas was killed and was no longer that figurehead, those who remained essentially created a new one. They created a golden cow to be their new object of worship, who would be the thing that ferries them off to the Tau system, to sentient society, so that they could survive the destruction of the sun eventually. And who better to take the Narmer faction back to Tau, back to sentient society, than an amalgam of sentient and sentient that they were already worshipping somewhat in the form of the Archons, which acted as key messianic figureheads in their organization. The Archons already take their name from the wide swath of Gnostic religious traditions, and so it makes sense to speculate that the Narmer faction already sees the Archons as being leaders in their faction, as religious figureheads in their faction, as opposed to just strong unit that fights for them. I believe it was in my video on the Voidbreaker update with Call that I was able to expound on this a little bit more, but Pazuul is a reference to the name Pazuzu, which is a god/demon of the Babylonians and the Assyrian culture. Though Pazuzu has a lot of very angry, scary, powerful, wrathful characteristics and attributes to them, Pazuzu was also a protector of mothers, pregnant mothers, and childbirth and the early life of children. And so the presentation of Pazuul as a guardian or protective deity to now lead the Narmer faction makes a lot of sense to me, to interpret it that way anyway. Again, we don't really have enough information on Pazuul and what's going on with Narmer to speculate too much further as to what's going to happen with them in the future. And with those three answered, we have gotten through all of Vlad's dangling thread questions. Thank you very much, Vlad. Big Deba asks, Ku Noma Elu Ra Ka Mara Lok, which, to respond to Big Deba, I don't know. I've tried to go into and analyze Void Tongue a little bit more a few times, using what resources are available on the wiki and trying to do a little bit of lingual analysis and try to get some idea of things like possible grammar and syntax out of Void Tongue, but I don't think I know any more than anyone else who's been looking into it at this time, and I also don't think I have the time or the skills to decipher it entirely. I have some theories about different ways that grammar and syntax for Void Tongue work that aren't really being used and aren't really corroborated for trying to decipher some of the Void Tongue's words. But we're also just kind of in a place where we don't have the full cipher and there's no way to get it fully because the Void Tongue cipher works differently than the other cipher languages in the Warframe setting. It's not alphabetical, it's per word, and so until we have a word for anything and something that directly shows us what the word means, then we don't have an answer to it. Lots of legwork, a long ongoing ARG activity for the community. Keep up with the wiki, and that's about all we can do. Thank you for your question, Big Deba. Sheer Siren Dragon asks, I've always been curious about the Knight of the Naga Drums, or more specifically, how Ballas survived and where he was all this time between then and suddenly showing up with the Lotus. If Ballas survived, it feels fair to assume others might have as well. This is a great question because we don't actually know too many specific details of the celebration of the Night of Naga Drums. We have a lot of information about what was happening around it and what we expect to have occurred at certain points during the major rebellion, as well as we have a lot of information about what was going on throughout the Origin system at the time of that specific ceremony. But we do know that the ceremony did not have all of the 7 actually present for the festivities. In general, we are aware that the Orokin executors tend not to gather. They tend to remain entirely isolated from each other most of the time. They travel in those big egg-shaped chariot pods in order to avoid contact with lower classes, to not be seen by people that are deemed as lesser than them. And they have the technology necessary to communicate without necessarily all being in the same spot. Beyond that, we know from the Beast of Bones story that the Orokin, even if killed, could be put into a different body, so they even tend not to consider ceremonies or being present for ceremonies to be all that important, especially after they were kind of put on notice early on that ceremony was an occasion for revolution and potential regicide. So some resulting changes to ceremonial procedure after Orden Karis almost did a regicide could be part of the reason why not all of the executors were present for the celebration of the Night of Naga Drums. But ultimately, we only know the fates of a certain number of the 7. We know that Karish was killed by Grendel. We know that Ballas was killed by us. We know that Tuval was killed by Varuna, and that Avantis was killed by a Grineer chainsaw. We do not know the whereabouts of Skarn, Tormis, or Nitok. But since Karish was not present for the celebration, they were off in a different part of the Origin system during the Night of Nagadromes when all of the Empire was defeated in a single night, it's very reasonable to suspect that Skarn, Tormus, and Nitok were also elsewhere. Nitok, we have no idea. We have no inkling. All we know is what Roth told us, and that doesn't give us much to go on. Skarn is potentially hiding in a tower in the void somewhere, so it's more likely that they're going to be introduced at some further point because they had a plan to hide in the void and continue the Orokin Empire in the void when the Zermin 10-0 and it seemed like the colonization of Tau was going to fail. He's the one that Roth quoted as saying, "We must fly the nest for the nest is on fire." So he was creating more contingencies for survival as a matter of course than the other ones were. And lastly, we have Executor Tormus, who we have even less information about what they were potentially doing during the rebellion, but they are described as a very competitive, sporty, brave kind of person. It's theorized that the muscular statue at Tauron Academy is Tormus because of these qualities. And so I think it's more reasonable to presume that Tormus is already dead because I feel like he would be actively fighting against the rebellion more aggressively than the other executors, who might be more self-preserving and might do more to flee. Nitok was also very aggressive and warlike, but she was also a little smarter, a little more conniving, manipulative, politician-like, to try to actually take over rulership and kill the rest of the seven. That's what she was doing at the time. Didn't work out for her, in the long run anyway. But I feel like it's more reasonable to assume she had some kind of contingency rather than she just died and no one knows what happened. So I very much expect that Nitok and Skarn at least will show up at some point in the future. I think the idea that the Executor Tormus died off screen and is going to have absolutely no role in the story ever is a little bit wasted potential from a storytelling perspective. Whatever form they happen to be in, though, is going to be pretty roughed up, in pretty bad shape, because if they are surviving through some means without a Yuvan, without the ability to reset their lifespans. So they are going to be very aged and decrepit on some kind of life support either way. Or if they're not, they achieved it by some means that we are going to have to learn about. But yes, I think it is absolutely fair to assume that the number of the seven, the executors that we don't know the whereabouts of, are in fact alive somewhere doing something. We shouldn't assume that they are dead just because they haven't had a role in the story yet. Warframe could continue on for another 20 years, so in that time, one could imagine we revisit 3 characters that are very important to the plot. Thank you for your question, Siren Dragon. Thank you for watching, everyone, and now my next question for you is, can you predict when the next episode of this series comes out?